Again, my name is Gerald Lenoir, and I'm the Executive Director of the Black Alliance and Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We're an organization that is relatively new to the immigrant rights struggle. We came about in 2006. If you remember back then, is when the massive demonstrations here in New York and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., across the country, the largest demonstrations in the history of this country were for immigrant rights. BAJI came together because we felt that there needed to be a progressive African-American voice speaking out in support of immigrant rights and making the connection for our communities about why we should support immigrant rights, why it is a racial justice issue. We have the opinion that the immigrant rights movement is one of the cutting-edge issues in the struggle for racial justice that started when the Native Americans of this land were exterminated and when my ancestors were brought over in chains as slaves. And that if we are interested in racial justice in this country, then we as African Americans need to support the immigrant rights movement. Because if you look at the discourse coming from the anti-immigrant movement, it is a discourse that is thoroughly racist. You hear on Fox News them talking about opposing the quote-unquote browning of America and the threat to Anglo-Saxon culture. You see groups like FAIR, Federation for American Immigration Reform, which is a bunch of white supremacists that have come together to persecute immigrants. And so if we as African Americans have a huge stake in the struggle against racism in this country, and we need to figure out how we can bring our communities together to fight for social and economic justice for all of us. I want to tell you a little bit about my relationship to the border. As Rafael said, the first time I went to the border was with a National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights delegation that both Rafael and I think Fahad was on that delegation. Fahad was my roommate. And so Drum was part of that delegation. And we saw firsthand what many people on this delegation saw. We talked to people who were human rights activists on both sides of the border. We talked to migrants. We talked to community people who were being harassed by Border Patrol. The second time I went to the border was the next year. I was so impacted by what I saw on the border that I went back to Oakland and organized a delegation of 12 African Americans and Black immigrants who, in June of 2007, we did another border tour. And I just want to say a little bit about the things that most impacted me. I think this presentation by the coroner's office, of course, was a major impact when you see the results of U.S. policy and how it is a life or death issue where people are being forced through the most treacherous part of the desert and are being robbed of their human rights. When you see the result of what the U.S. is doing in such graphic terms, then you have to respond. The second thing that really impacted us was we went to a little town on the other side of the border. How many people have been to Altar? Who's been to Altar? Altar is one of the staging grounds. You've been there. It's one of the staging grounds for people to gather. They meet the coyote that's going to take them across the desert. And there's a square there in front of a huge Catholic cathedral where people gather. So we were able to move around that square and talk to people who had come from Mexico, from different parts of Central America. And we asked them, why are you risking your life to come across this desert? And the answer was invariably, we need work. The price of corn has dropped. The price of coffee has dropped. We can't make a living. We need work. We're very clear that the issues of economic justice are wrapped up in this issue of immigrant rights and of what's going on the border. We're very clear that the United States has a major role to play in the collapse of the Mexican economy and the reason why people come to the United States. So those are the messages that we brought back to our communities. We also try to put this in a global context because this is not just happening in the United States. This is a worldwide phenomenon. The UN has estimated that over 200 million people across this globe are living in countries that are not their home countries. And many of them are refugees of the global economy. Globalization has reached throughout the countries of the global south and have distorted economies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and have forced people to leave their home countries. Migration that we haven't seen in the history of this planet is now occurring because of economic forces. I was able to go to Italy with a colleague and interview Eritrean refugees who had come across the Sahara Desert, similar to what we saw in those pictures, where many people lost their lives, who then also had to cross the Mediterranean Sea to get to Italy. And they told similar stories of not being able to put food on the table for their families. Many of these were young men who were the oldest in their families who were sent out by their families. And what did they get when they reached Italy is this anti-immigrant backlash. They get jailed, they get persecuted. Many of them get returned back to their home countries. We have many of the countries in North Africa that have signed agreements with European powers to turn back migrants. And so you have that same kind of anti-immigrant hysteria throughout Europe. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. The rise of racism and the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment is sweeping this planet. And so we have the responsibility and the duty to look at it as it is in its global context and figure out how do we build alliances across borders, how do we build alliances within the United States with groups that are not considered immigrant communities, and how do we begin to look at this as a struggle for democracy within our country and throughout the world. I grew up in the civil rights era, and the struggle of the African American for civil rights in this country was at that point the cutting edge issue for democracy in this country. And as a result of that struggle, many other struggles were organized. The Chicano struggle, the women's movement, all these movements came in the wake of the civil rights movement. And many of us gained from those movements. The 1965 immigrant bill that took away quotas from many parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America was a result of the civil rights struggle. And so today, I think that we in that same vein, the immigrant rights movement is one of the cutting edge issues in the struggle for democracy. And if we look at the border, what's going on at the border, the intense militarization of the border, the daily violations of human rights on both sides of that border, and the complicity of the United States in the deaths in the desert, and the labeling of people who do reach the other side as quote-unquote illegal. So what the corporations do, they can bring subsidized crops to Mexico, destroy the Mexican economy, bring back the profits across that border, and that's perfectly legal. But when people cross the border looking for work, then they're labeled illegal. And so this is the contradiction that we have to lift up and really get people in these United States to understand that what is happening in the world is a result of economic exploitation and racism. And we have to figure out a way to bring these border issues into the debate, bring these issues of NAFTA into the debate, and really look at how we change the terms of the debate. That's what we brought back from the border. That's the struggle that the Black Alliance for Just Immigration has been waging since we came back from the border, to try to help change the debate based upon what we know is the true culprits in the struggle for human rights. So I'll stop there and let my other colleagues talk about their experience on the border. Thank you. Interested in racial justice in this country, then we as African Americans need to support the immigrant rights movement. Because if you look at the discourse coming from the anti-immigrant movement, it is a discourse that is thoroughly racist. American Voice speaking out in support of immigrant rights and making the connection for our communities about why we should support immigrant rights, why it is a racial justice issue. We have the opinion that the immigrant rights movement back then is when the massive demonstrations here in New York and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., across the country, the largest demonstrations in the history of this country were for immigrant rights. Baji came together because we felt that there needed to be a progressive African evening. And my name is Gerald Lenoir, and I'm the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We're an organization that is relatively new to the immigrant rights struggle. We came about in 2006, if you remember, is one of the cutting edge issues in the struggle for racial justice that started when the Native Americans of this land were exterminated and when my ancestors were brought over in chains as slaves. And that if we are